Hi, Kaajal.
Morning, how are you?
Hi, morning.
Good, good. I just want to
I'm alright, not
ensure
too bad.
that this is the first time I'm using Riverside, so I just want to make sure that the audience link is out. Just bear with me a minute.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
And if not, I'm just going to keep.
Now, this one doesn't do any blurring of the background, does it, in
Um,
case people walk by? I
let me
don't think it does.
let me chat GPT it for you.
I
There
don't
must
think
be
it
a
does.
way. Um, there has to be. I
Should
mean,
be.
all these
Should
AI
be.
things must have something. Let's see. Yes, you can blur your background in Riverside, um, but you need another tool. You have to use something called OBS, Open Broadcaster Software.
We'll go with it.
Yeah.
Let's go with
Okay.
what we have. It's fine.
Well, either way, I'm going to start recording this anyway. Those who can't make it can't make it.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just going to put that
Yeah, yeah,
link there
absolutely.
if they're there. Ah, okay. Someone says he's waiting for it to start. Wonderful. Okay. Ta-da. This is where I wish I had someone to help me do the tech while I'm doing the chat. Okay. Okay. Well, I think we can start. Welcome. Thank you very much for making the time to chat with me. I know this has been going back and forth for a couple of months. Um, please, if you can just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and your background, and yes, floor is yours.
Okay. So, first of all, thanks very much for the invite, Kajal. My name is Partha, full name Partha Kar. I'm a consultant in diabetes. I work in Portsmouth. And I'm also one of the national diabetes leads, have been for a fair few years, and at the moment is focused into the technology space, hybrid closed loops, continuous glucose monitors, access, etc. So that's pretty
Wonderful.
much a bit
Actually,
about
you're the
me.
best person I need to speak to about because I've been on the CGM, the Flash, for almost 10 years. And
Uh,
for the longest time, I'm like, I need a closed loop because I'm running
okay.
around like a crazy person most of the time. And I asked my doctor about two and a half months ago, the nurse, and they're like, oh, our area hasn't received funding. And I'm like, hmm. So I think you can tell us more about this as we go along. But I, I
Yeah, yeah, no problem at all.
wanted to
Yeah.
ask, like, what made you go into endocrinology and diabetes?
So I think it's part of your training. I think I always mention names of people like Dr. David Jenkins and Dr. Tony Zalin. They were there in the Midlands when I was training, and I think they were of the belief that you as a diabetes senior or a consultant, you could become like a guide in people's lives, like not a gatekeeper. And I always use it to be a guide, not a gatekeeper. So they were like, oh, you could be on this journey and it would be fun and you could help them along. So I think that was very different from the procedure based other specialties
Mm,
like gastro and respiratory and
mm,
chest medicine and all that. And I think that's what attracted me towards it. And yeah, no, so that probably has been the driver, or the ability to have that communication, be part of the journey.
apologies,
So it's been quite good. Yeah,
apologies. My
that's
blood
what brings
sugar's
me here.
going low, but I've eaten. It's just a delay. Sorry, go on.
No, so yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's what brought me to this space, so to speak, as a specialty.
Okay,
So
and
yeah, that's
how
been the
long have
journey, I would
you
say.
been focused in endocrinology and diabetes?
Consultant. Well, I've been a consultant, but so obviously our training is for 5, 6 years. I've done that, and then become a consultant. So that's been 16 years now,
Wow.
16 and a half
Okay.
years. So yeah,
And
it's been
how
some
have you
time.
seen I don't want to use the growth of, but I'm looking at patterns, the growth of diabetes over years?
Hmm. So I think it depends on the type of diabetes you're talking about. I think with type 2 diabetes, I think as the world has changed, world has become much more, I think I would say environment is very obesogenic, if that makes sense. It doesn't drive you towards more exercise. The food is different. So I think type 2 diabetes
Mm,
rates have gone up globally, which is why in this country they've got the type 2 diabetes prevention program, etc. I think type 1 diabetes rates have also gone up. I think there's many people talk a lot about the
mm,
impact of COVID, environmental factors, but there's certainly been a growth in that sector, probably not as high as type 2. And that's probably, and I think also not to forget, there's been better diagnosis as well. So I think all that clicks together to say that, yeah, that's probably the reason why there's been a
mm,
growth
mm,
in
mm.
diabetes rates.
I I've I mean I've been diabetic 33 years, type 1. And in all the time I've been diabetic, they still don't have a real reason why type 1 happens. Now, obviously you're more in the
Yeah.
research and the
Mm.
tech and how things are moving, and there's obviously more energy going into this part of things. Is there any inkling of understanding how type 1 is manifesting?
No, I mean, I think there are billions and billions of pounds and dollars put into trying to find out the reason. And I think if they cracked the reason, then they probably would have
100%.
cracked it full stop, right? And I think there's a lot, and obviously it's the autoantibody driven process. I think what people have struggled to understand what sort of
Mm,
triggers the autoantibodies, etc., in people. So there's been lots
yeah.
of theories, lots of science. And I think that's why things like immunotherapy and stuff are coming into being, works of people like Colin Dyan and stuff like that. But it's still in the stage of people sort of thinking what may be the case. I don't think that anybody's nailed it. I think if they nailed it, then we probably would have found the perfect tool to
100%.
stop it full stop. And that's not there yet. So plenty of conjecture, plenty of studies, but no
We
clear cut
still don't have
answers
it.
as of
Okay.
yet.
Yeah, no, I completely agree about type 2. So, what I've noticed in the time I've been diabetic, I mean, so I'm in between the UK, Dubai, and Zambia. So I grew up in Zambia, and in all the time I've been here, everyone's always known me as the diabetic. And now, as time has gone by, I think more in developing nations. So I guess you could say probably in India too, China, the type 2 rate is that much faster because it's trying to catch up to the West, I guess you could say. At least like in the UK and the US, as you say, they've got diabetes
Hmm.
prevention plans. But a lot of these countries I've seen, they are the medical infrastructure is set up for infectious diseases and not for NCDs, particularly diabetes. And then you've got eating,
Mm.
junk food, et cetera,
Mm.
et cetera. So I'm trying to break a myth, the stigma around it, especially being a person of color, like being Indian, but then having
Yeah.
traveled within Arab
Yeah.
communities, African communities. When people look at you and like, oh, you're diabetic, they're like, oh, you don't look diabetic. But it's like, but what does that mean? So
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
apart from medication and
Yeah.
having prevention programs, I think part of that is also just weaving in awareness, because there's this misunderstanding
Hmm.
between type 1 and type 2. They just put diabetes in one, container.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always been a big problem. I think, there'll be different sectors of the community which have different views about it, right? I think, does diabetes, the word diabetes, have a stigma full stop? The answer is yes, right? So there's the narrative. So we break it down and you talk about, if only you ate a bit better, you wouldn't get diabetes. And you're sitting there going like, well, that's not true in any types of diabetes. That's sort of
100%.
very simplistic narrative. But then when you drill it down to type 1, that's incredibly unfair on people who've had it for such a long time,
Yeah.
especially for children and going to schools and you're sitting there going like, well, this has got nothing to do with, you know. So you have that sort of divide that sort of creeps upon. And there's a lot of people in the type 1 diabetes community who've come to me and said, I
Yeah.
wish it was named differently. And I go like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I can't change those sort of things. But what you get is there is an overarching stigma about diabetes, and I think so. And I think a very good example of that is advocacy. You've got more people with type 1
Yeah.
diabetes doing advocacy because they're very keen to come out and say, look, this is how it happened. This is what we do, blah, blah, blah. And then you don't have a huge amount of people
Yeah.
in the type 2 space because of the stigma attached with it. Because if you're labeled with type 2, you're like, clearly you were lazy and you didn't run, and all that sort of narrative comes into play. And people are like, "Do you know what? I can't be bothered with that." So you have that sort of thing, which across the board isn't. And I think a lot of it is about misinformation. And the world is a very funny world. It works in very short, sharp
Yeah.
narratives, catchy narratives,
Yeah.
controversial narratives. So that works very well for people, sadly, and that's
Yeah.
what brings
It's
all the stigma
it's
with it.
it's really unfortunate. I mean, I I grew up not knowing any diabetics because number one, type 1 or type 2. But as I've gotten older, I still don't know, particularly female type 1 diabetics. And so I've got a couple of my male friends. They live their life, but they don't go out advocating. Whereas for me, I need to advocate because
mm,
I've had, like, from a diabetic point of view, I've had people look at me think
mm.
I ate too many sweets, or you got an Indian auntie somewhere saying, no,
Yeah,
don't do this, or you should have done this. And it's
yeah.
frustrating
Don't do
because,
this. Yeah, yeah.
especially type 1, we didn't really ask for it, it just happens, so I mean, for
Mm,
me, I mean, I the story I know, they say that you have like it's almost like a viral infection, and I believe so. I was diagnosed at 5, but at like 3 years old, I must have caught a really bad cough, and it was quite I was quite sick for a while. And so my mom was like, but why would you have become diabetic at 5
mm.
if at 3 you were sick? And I'm like, it could have manifested. But again, we don't have that kind of information. But again, it's not
Information, absolutely.
black or white, And I think that's the thing with type 1 diabetes. If we had it black and white, you're right, we would have had a lot more going for us in terms
Yeah.
of what do you call it? Which I
Treatment,
think you're doing a great
intervention,
job about
everything.
at the moment.
So
But
more
definitely
knowledge.
a cure. And I think there's always these memes that are going on about, oh, we're still waiting for a cure, and we're getting older. But like, I want you to talk more about the work you're doing with like nice and challenging things, because with I think your name has grown so much in the past couple of years because you've been really pushing for something which we've all been asking for, but maybe we don't have the platform to. Because, for example, for me, I didn't sleep well last night because I had a low sugar. So it affects our productivity. And imagine that times two, three things in the day. You have to act like a pancreas, and then you have to be productive. So we ourselves as type 1 diabetes are tired.
Mm,
And then to advocate, to ask for something that's going to make our lives
yeah,
easier, and then be
yeah,
told that actually we don't have the funding, or
yeah.
you know what, this is too expensive for us. I think what you're doing is a fantastic job. And if you're able to even show that actually it's going to be cheaper for the NHS in the long run, or diabetics around the world in the long run, because we will be looking after ourselves better, therefore needing maybe less insulin, having a healthier life. I think that's really important. But if you could just walk us through how you started doing this and advocating for it, that would be really helpful for those listening in who may not know what you've been doing so far.
So I think, my role, I think the clinical role that I do, and I think the policy role that I do, I think it's important, and I say this to lots of leaders in different spaces, is that your role isn't just to create policy on a document. Your role is also to be the advocate, because one thing you discovered very quickly is in a room where decisions are being made, the people about whom the decisions are being made are very rarely
100%.
represented, if ever at all, right? So thereby, you as a clinician are the only person, right? And if you don't do it, then who does, right? So there's nobody else left. So that's the principle to which I have worked, and I think putting type 1 diabetes on the map has been a big thing for me to say that, I always say to people, if you don't have type 1 diabetes, I always do this thing where I say, think about your most loved one in your life. I said, all right. So, okay, let's say by a stroke of magic, the type of magic you don't really want, they now have type 1 diabetes. Do you want them to get a CGM or not? Would you want them to prick their fingers? And they go, oh, of course we want them to have a CGM. And I said, well, there you go. So if you want your loved one to have it, why are you trying to stop it from other people getting it? So I think, and then comes a different debate about is it cost effective, the taxpayers' money? But that's the job that I have, right, to make that argument that it's a cost effective use. But I think, the saying always is that, think like a patient and act like a taxpayer. It's very important, right? So you got to think. And I think that's what I keep on saying to people is that if you don't have the condition,
Yeah.
think if your loved one had it. What now? And I think that's been probably within the driving force of the advocacy work that I do is giving the narrative, saying to people, this is what might help. And I think over the years, that's probably what's changed the sort of game. CGM access started from whatever it was, 1%. It's now
Yeah.
98, 97%. And hybrid closed loops are moving as well. So I think it's brought into the national focus. And I think a couple of other things that's happened, targeting into areas like pregnancy, which has now shown really good outcomes for mums and babies, they're all important. So I think in an NHS which is also starved of any good news, it is a
Absolutely.
good news story. which hopefully shows the way for other people to do
We're
similar
very
in other
happy that you've been
areas.
doing all this work. I mean, I've spoken to so many diabetics, and the number of people who knew that we were even talking about it, they were so excited because we all are so thankful to have some sort of CGM on us. I remember when, was it probably about 10 to 12 years ago? No, no, longer than that. Time is arbitrary to me. Probably about 15 years ago. And they'd just gotten the MediSense sensor. And I remember going to my consultant, and they put it on me for a week. But it wasn't mine, it was just to borrow. And it was fine, but obviously I didn't have a device on me to actually see what was going on. But I think that was the beginning of flash monitoring. So the only way they could see my real life data was through that, which was being sent to them. But the problem is, again, you go back to your doctor a week later, or as we say, after maybe even 6 months. What happened on this date at this time? Why were you high? Life happens, especially as a type 1. Like, you could be on a menstrual cycle, you could be stressed, you could have decided to eat one sweet that day because you was whatever it was. So it shows that so much has been going on for so long. But I think what you've been doing in the past couple of years has really been quite an exponential growth, because every other diabetic I know is on a CGM. And I think a lot of these CGM companies are now competing, because there's even non diabetics who are using some sort of CGM, not just for as preventative measures, I guess you could say. There's a whole movement towards that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have the sort of, I think it's called the galvanization
Mm.
of the people, isn't it? And I think people have faith and you have hope, and I think that drives a lot of people towards it as well, as it should be. So I think that's a good thing, I would say. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that that's as it
No,
should be
definitely,
going
definitely.
forwards.
I'm
Yeah.
just hoping as time goes by, the pumps could get smaller. I remember trying, was it the G7 Medisense? But for me, it was as thick. It was thicker than a phone, and so it was just too big on my body. So, but I think as technology is going forward, and with so much competition between all these different companies, they are going to be bringing out newer, smaller. It's like how chips in phones, we've got everything's become smaller and smaller. I'm hoping it'll be a quick turnaround for every diabetic to have a small pump that is just, maybe even under the skin.
I think every tech company will be looking at how to innovate, right? And I think innovation will be based on what people feel is useful for them. I think that's quite important. And I think that's where these things will go. So as it innovates will be about quality of life. Innovation will be about what makes it easier, more smaller,
Yeah,
more catchier, more all of that. And I think you can already see some signs of it with different
yeah,
companies coming up, more colorful pumps, less tubes, less this, less that, smaller size. So I think that's just a natural progression. I mean, you've had the same with CGM, and I suspect the
yeah.
same will
No, I
happen with that
completely
as well.
agree. Just trying to go through some of our notes to ensure that we've covered most of the things. I think we've actually covered quite a bit. Um, my other question is, so for certain communities that are marginalized within the UK and abroad, for those who don't have access to technology, how do you think we're able to get this, which is a need for us, to them?
So I think I think there are two basic things to say on that. Number one is deprivation and ethnicity gaps are two different problems, right? And I think people don't appreciate that. So that's important to recognize. They need two
Yeah.
very clear different strategies. Tackling deprivation is a lot about working with social councils. How do people put food on the table? Working with all of that government, etc. And then now there is intersectionality, but that's fundamentally different to ethnicity, where a lot of it is structural bias, individual bias, racism, all of that. So I think the approach that I have, and we've got good coverage across all ethnicities right now because it's so high that everybody's got it. I think there's two approaches. One is you have to challenge directly people, which is my job. I think a strategy of here is some data, can you do better, is not a strategy, right? You need to have a better, most powerful strategy than that. You have to hold people to account going forwards. That's number one. And I think the second one, I would say, which is quite important, is that use the peer support groups, which is quite important. And you've got people like you're there, you are representative. And I think it also gives a lot of people then from an Asian
Yes.
background to think, oh, hang on, you know, she's got type 1 as well. So I think it's that sort of advocacy work. So going back to your point, a lot of people don't, but I think the people like yourselves who do, it becomes quite important.
It's from the
So
ground
all of
up.
that helps.
That's the thing. I like to get my hands dirty and like get into
Absolutely.
communities and talk and help and try and be light.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The only thing which, and you can add on to this, where I struggle is so that even if I'm doing all this work, like for example, I'm part of the Diabetes Association here. I've been made the chairperson of Zambia. And so the unfortunate part is, especially with Southern Africa, West Africa, again, because the medical and I'm presuming also India as well. I spoke to Jazz Sethi from Diabestes as well. Now she's doing fantastic work out there. The only thing is, in order to have that kind of structure in
Mhm.
place for then, let's just say, foreign aid to come in to provide any sort of funding for any of this medication awareness campaigns, etc. I feel like they can't do
Mm.
so
Mm.
because we don't have enough data. To get the data in the first place, when you're in these communities that don't even recognize diabetes, and especially when you've got all these stigmas and urban myths, etc., it's almost like a catch 22. How do you think we can get around it to get the data in order to then show these organizations or foreign aid for emerging economies to be able to tackle something that's growing so quickly?
So I think there's two ways of looking at it. I think first of all, so just to make you aware that we are, or I am basically doing a
Okay.
big piece of work in India right now, which is about improving type 1 diabetes care. And a lot of the work is centered around how do you work with governments about access? How do you work? Because over there, the bigger challenge is how do you get people
Right.
even to basal
Hmm.
bolus insulin to begin with? And having the education around it. So that's quite important. And I think that goes in hand with how do you inculcate the atmosphere whereby you're trying to get data collection as a major stream. So data is what convinces finally politicians to loosen the stream. So we're in the foothills of that journey, I would say, and you're absolutely right. I think that is a big piece of the work whereby how do we get data? So we do how do we get a national
Mm.
database, right, with type 1 diabetes in a place like India? And it's a vast country. So do we start with certain states? Show there's some really good work going on in Tamil Nadu. There's some really good work going in West Bengal. So I think the question is, how do you then corral them together to show to governments, hey, listen, look, this is what can happen if you move people
Yes.
over to a basal bolus and then CGM and then technology. So I suspect that it's more about. So India is going through a very interesting phase where India is a very different country from what it was 20 years ago. I always say there are two types of India. There's the India which is economically booming, the
Yes.
India of Shah Rukh Khan and all that sort of stuff. And there's also an India which is
Yeah.
struggling to get their insulins on time, store their insulin. So there is that dichotomy. And I think it's a responsibility of that first group to rise up and make the case and do use their privilege to help the second group. And I think it's happening. I think there are a fair few professionals I've spoken to. I'm again going back there in December. And that's the galvanizing thing. How do you guys help the ones who are not as
Yeah.
privileged like you? And I think that will involve, as you said, data collection will
I'm
be a
glad you said
fundamental
it
part
that
of
way,
that.
the two groups, because it's very similar in Southern Africa as well. There's a very small amount, very small percentage that have a crap ton of money. And then there's the rest of the country, the
Mm.
communities that are struggling with electricity to keep their insulin cold. They don't have access to the insulin. The insulin is priced exponentially high. They're out in the villages. They don't necessarily even know what this is. So it's you're right. It's the responsibility of those who are earning or who have that money of these countries to be able to give back in order to build the economy and the countries and the healthcare of these nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, in South Africa, I've interacted with a lot of colleagues in South Africa. You're absolutely right. There's the insurance, there's the government, the coverage is very different, and who covers what is also very
Yeah.
variable. So that's always a challenge. And I think it's about how does that
Mm.
group who are privileged do the work needed to help others, and that's the sort of big challenge. I think the challenge also has to be towards industry as well, because if you accept that the economy is not flat across the globe, every country's economic power isn't the same, then why should
Exactly.
your pricing be the same? That makes no sense, right? So you should have different levels of pricing. You should think about
Hmm.
lower middle income countries hiring. You should have different price sets going accordingly, and you can. So that would be my view. I think there's a lot of work that can be done in this space. So that's very important, I think, to open the doors up for
100%.
lots of other countries.
I've noticed over here in Zambia, like on national TV, after the 7 o'clock news, there's about three adverts that are just juice. When I mean juice, like juice that's been added in with sugar. So according to the layman, they're not going to know any different because of the way fast food and drink and just these things are advertised. And unfortunately, the regular man on the road, they are very impressionable. And so I always say, if you can
Hmm.
sell to them a sweet drink, a sweet product, a certain lifestyle, you can also do it with the healthy version too. So if you suddenly start saying, we're using stevia, I'm just saying, I'm not that everyone's all for sweetener, but if you start talking about stevia, people are like, oh, why? And then like, oh, but she can't have sugar or he can't have sugar. Oh, why? Oh, what's diabetes? And it starts a trickle process of thinking, but you can't have that process of thinking if you're being shoved with fast food and junk and that kind of thing on. And I think it
Yeah,
also starts from that
yeah,
level too.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's about
Mm,
the information that's all around us, isn't it? As I said at the very beginning, it's a very obesogenic environment, right? The temptation is always there. When I was growing up, our breakfast is fundamentally different from the breakfast adverts and the breakfast that's available for kids everywhere.
yes.
You go to Sainsbury. I think that's a fundamental change as to how things have evolved. And you look to our parents' generation; they have a very
Mm,
different diet, very different way, portion. All of it was very different. So I think that's had an impact. I think it's fair to say there is, however, due to the work that a lot of yourselves do, there is a rising awareness that
yes.
people need to change their ways. But I think it's fair that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a big sea change as to how we look at
Mm,
food and what is food. And we seem to be in the start of a journey where
yeah.
people are rethinking what they eat and what goes in and all that sort of stuff. But in general, yeah, the environment has changed as a result of which the factors and
Mm,
obesity and
mm,
everything
mm.
else has gone
Now,
with
I
it.
also say that, going back to our grandparents, great grandparents, they may have worked more physical
Mm,
jobs, whether they worked in a factory, whether they worked on a field, whatever it may be. And so they would have eaten more wholesome carbohydrates to fuel their body. But then now imagine going down generations, they may still be eating that way because, oh well, we're going to eat in our family group. We eat, let's just say from an Indian point of view, you're going to have rice and chapati, for example, and your parents, then you will continue eating that way. But the difference is your activities have changed. Now you're sitting at a
mm,
desk job. So they say wide waistline, and then this adds on to the
yeah,
type 2 diabetes. It's definitely, I also feel, a huge cultural thing because of, or not necessarily cultural, but also a mental thing, generationally, because we, as you say, fundamentally we've changed the ways we're eating. But also sometimes you'll see all these adverts, oh, to have eggs and avocado for breakfast. But if everyone else is eating, I don't know,
yeah,
sorghum
yeah,
porridge, I'm just saying, for example, you're going to just go with what the family's doing. So it's
yeah.
also a very fine line between the two.
100%. 100%. I think it's also, let's not forget on that line, the issues of the cultural issues, right? How we look
Yes.
at, festivals and stuff. And if you haven't had your whole plate of sweets in our culture, then you have disrespected everybody around you and you're going like, not really, I don't want to have all the sweets. So I think those shifts are very important. That every festival is greeted with gazillions of sweet
Yeah,
food, and it's the cultural. I think that needs to shift
absolutely.
at that level as well, because if you're accustomed to what's happening all
Yeah,
around you, sometimes peer pressure as well, right? You're not going to go to a pub lunch with everybody, and while everybody's ordered their steak and
I'm
fish
gonna
and
have a
chips, and
salad.
you're going to go like, oh, do you know what, I fancy a salad. Very rarely, because I think a lot of people find it very difficult to do it because they're in that peer group. And some people will do it, but a lot of people go like, well, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah,
Does it make me look awkward? So I'm
yeah.
just going to order something. So that is a very important thing. These are the cultural nuances, the socioeconomic things that we talk about, the environment, I call it, which all
Yeah,
contributes to
absolutely. I
the
mean,
issues that we have.
Diwali's what, next week, and I've already can hear it from family members like, "Oh,
Hmm.
we're just not going to be diabetic for the day." These are the things they'll say, but you can't.
Yeah.
You can't not be diabetic for the day. But this is where, if it we need to switch that thinking. Like, if it's okay for you to take a break from your diabetes, no, you should understand how it's affecting your body, because clearly you don't know how it's affecting your body, and you're making it okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely.
well, I think we've covered a lot of really good things today. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I wasn't sure if anyone has any questions and if they're able to send it through, or if they'd sent it through via Instagram. But if not, I will I will send them through to you at some point, if that's okay. But this has
Absolutely.
been
Please
a
do. Please
wonderful
do. Please do.
conversation, because I think what you're working on is so fundamental, and you are literally the captain of our ship, and we're on the ship just pushing things along, doing our advocacy work. So it just gives us light.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also going to, since you're being so nice with compliments, Kajal, I'm going to say that I think the work that you guys do, I think, don't forget, I always
Yeah.
say, I don't have type 1 diabetes, right? Um,
Mm.
I do my job
Mm.
for which I get paid, right? I think what you all are doing yourself, in this space, trying to do it because you want to make a difference, I think is much more inspirational and much more heartwarming to see. I mean, because I think people forget that. I think I come with my privilege. That's important to understand. I'm a consultant.
Yeah.
I'm a man, right? I'm all of that, right?
Yeah.
So there comes to the power dynamics. But I think for you all, you're a woman, you come from a South Asian background, you've got type 1 diabetes, you've got lots of things which you have to battle through, and you're doing this piece of work. So I think that's quite inspirational. So I think please carry on with what you're doing. I think that's great. So and I always say,
Mm.
sometimes you will feel like, oh, have I made a difference? If you made a difference to one person, you made a difference, one more person than you ever would have if you didn't do it.
Absolutely.
That's good.
I appreciate
So,
that. Thank you.
carry on with
Sometimes I
it,
do
I
get
would
a
say.
bit tired with things. I'm like, when is this ever going to make a change? So I appreciate your words, and you've highlighted a lot of things that I do think about, but I don't put it at the forefront of my mind, because then I'll feel low. But we just have to push through. We have to keep on keeping on.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
if we've got you as a foot in the door, in the right rooms,
Indeed.
we're going to lean on you. So we appreciate the work that you do, and looking forward to seeing all of your work from India. And we'll definitely speak soon. Have
Thank
a
you so
great
much,
morning.
Kajal.
Take
Thanks
care.
for the invite.
Bye.
Thank you.